Our media overlords, in their infinite wisdom, have decided to fill up the media cycle with penetrating stories, such as the Pepsi-Cola Corporation, who owns the Quaker Oats Company, forcing them to change the name of Aunt Jemima syrup to Pearl Milling Company. Despite the fact that Aunt Jemima was a celebration of African Americans and in no way derogatory, the old brand is being ditched, much like Uncle Ben's. These products were made to pay respectful tribute to revered figures and were always seen as such. Until now. I mean, it absolutely positively must be an insult to place an African American on anything, like the $20 bill, which ironically is being pushed at the very same time that this other obscurantist campaign to efface the past is. Yeah, given the state of social justice warriors and the left's penchant to eat its own, I'm sure that'll age well. This and other astonishing predictions on The Daniel and Tal Show. A little history lesson. Nation-states as we know them are incredibly new. Most modern historians trace them back no further than the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Well, how did modern nation-states come about? We'll take England as an example. Around 1140 AD, King Henry II went off to the Middle East to fight in the Crusades. Before he left, he had tremendous power. It was the king who made the laws, ran the state, and steered the policies of his nation. Knowing that he'd be gone for several years, though, Henry did something of profound significance. He set up a bureaucracy that would rule in his absence. The only problem was, when he got back, the people he had deputized to run things didn't want to give up power. So the king had innovated himself out of a job. He made himself obsolete. A power struggle ensued between the monarchs and this early proto-deep state, which was made up of the aristocrats. A sort of soft civil war commenced between the king and the nobles. They wanted him to be a figurehead rather than a real ruler. In the king's absence, the aristocrats realized that though none of them had the power to fight the king individually, collectively, they had more money and more soldiers than he did. So as a cabal, they were a group to be reckoned with. Things came to a head in the year 1215 when the aristocrats kidnapped King John and took him out into the woods, putting a knife to his throat, forcing him to sign Magna Carta. It's significant to note that Magna Carta did not give power to the people. It gave power to the oligarchs, who now arrogated the authority to write the laws, instead of the king. This is when they created the House of Lords. The king knew how dangerous a position he was in. His very life depended on him doing something. He hit upon a plan. Back then, it's important to remember that serfs served two functions. They were farmers on the land baron's property, but they had to pull double duty and act as soldiers if an oligarch went to war against a rival oligarch or in a foreign campaign. The king decided to throw in his fortunes with the people and to triangulate around the aristocrats. He did this by luring peasants off the nobles' land with the promise of more political rights if they just moved to the king's new municipality, which he called a free city. Back then, you'd see references to the free city of Freiburg or the free city of Lübeck. What this was an urban center created by the monarch to lure the serfs off the aristocrats' land and into the city that the king controlled. By this method, he could increase his coffers by taxing them and drain away soldiers from the oligarchs. For the king, it was a twofer. This was the first stirring of the modern nation-state and a warning call for the death of the old feudal system. That would take another massive blow when the Black Plague swept through Europe. It killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe within a single 3-month period. With the labor pool having shrunk, the workers now had more leverage. Everyone wanted to lure them back into the fields. Because of the shortage of serfs, they could negotiate for more political rights, which brought us one step closer to the modern nation-state. But the final death knell was the Industrial Revolution, when people were lured away from the farms to the cities as countries began to urbanize. The feudal system was officially dead, and with it, the power of the oligarchs, whose power was based on the land. Back then, the more land you had, the more wealth you had. This was thrown on its head when factories innovated economies and the source of wealth was no longer fields. Old feudal states began to collapse with modern nation-states emerging, banning titles of nobility like Austria did, replacing serfs with citizens. Needless to say, this did not sit well with the old aristocracy, who resented the conspiracy between the king and the people to drain away their power. In ancient Greece, they had a word for this: a tyrant. A tyrant was not a dictator or an autocrat as we think about it today. We use them as synonyms, but they're really not. A tyrant in its classical meaning was someone from the rich class who appealed to the people to help him fight members of his own class. This is why the left never got tired of calling President Trump a tyrant. In a sense, they were right. He made populist appeals to the people in an effort to help him fight the emerging oligarchical class in America. He sided with the hoi polloi to help stave off attacks from this new aristocracy. This elite class, like in days of old, doesn't like leaders. It prefers figureheads. They don't want the people anywhere near power, and instead prefer to run things themselves from behind the scenes. This form of government is of course called an oligarchy. Plato talks about this in his book The Republic. He describes what happens when an honest man gets into power and tries to stop the oligarchy. Plato writes, "He founders against the state as upon a sunken reef, and he and all that he has is lost." He may have been a general or some other high officer who was brought to trial under a prejudice raised by informers, and either put to death or exiled or deprived of the privileges of a citizen, and all his property taken from him. Plato describes the corrupt oligarchs trumping up what we today would call a Soviet show trial to discredit the honest man and run him out of town. Sadly, we're watching this today play out in Washington, D.C. as Democrats preside over a kangaroo court to try and unconstitutionally impeach a private citizen, namely Donald J. Trump. Ron Paul has an article in the New American where he writes about a procedural vote in the Senate on the constitutionality of removing from office someone who is not in office, and how Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, who is required by the Constitution to preside, has by refusing to participate made it clear that he does not consider the upcoming action in the Senate to be a legitimate impeachment trial. Nevertheless, as the charade begins, 6 Republicans flip to the side of the Democrats to endorse the proceedings. This despite the fact that, as R. Court Kirkwood points out, the Constitution says, "The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for, and conviction of, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to the law." Because Trump is no longer president, attorneys Bruce Castor and David Schoen argue in their brief removing him from office is impossible. Thus, the current proceeding before the Senate is void ab initio, as a legal nullity that runs patently contrary to the plain language of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution states, "Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy an office of honor." What's clear is this is not a constitutional procedure, any more than the previous election procedures were expressions of the actual election laws which saw Trump driven from the White House. Rule of law seems perilously close to being in jeopardy, if you notice. And that's just what Aristotle says in his book Politics. Only the middle class, he writes, believe in the rule of law. The poor are indifferent to the law, and the rich do not think that the law should apply to them. So the oligarchs rule by whim, by emotion, by vindictive attacks. They saw Trump as an obstacle to their power. They're not interested in Republican models or modern nation states. Nation states have always been a conspiracy between the king and the people to roll back the power of the oligarchs. And now the oligarchs want that power back. So that means destroying the middle class, erasing all notions of rule of law, reversing the Industrial Revolution, which is why they want to deindustrialize North America through projects like Agenda 2030, send our factories back to China, and turn us back into a massive plantation colony. The whole trend of this is to turn us back from citizens into serfs. This is why the World Economic Forum is bragging that within 10 years we will own nothing. While the oligarchs will not relinquish their property rights, you will be asked to. You will license everything and own nothing. This is their new model, which is in essence a very old model. They want to take us back to the Middle Ages, back into a time when the oligarchs ran everything. There was no voting, no free markets. You weren't allowed to charge what you wanted for your own products. You were told what prices to set by the guilds. Likewise, you weren't allowed to innovate. If you tried to change what you made in terms of coming up with a new design for shoes, you were told that you had to make them exactly like your father and grandfather made them. This is why the medieval period was so stagnant, why it was a 1,000-year period known as the Dark Ages. It was centralized rule from above, very much like what we think of today as a communist state. The people had no power. Innovation was not allowed. The so-called creative destruction that arises from capitalism was forbidden. The oligarchs don't like destabilizing innovations. They like things held in arthritic status quos. The people suffered horribly under this model for a millennium. But don't worry, being a serf isn't all that bad. Their carbon footprint was minuscule. And you can take comfort that yours too will be, if these people get their way. Before you is a moral puzzle. If you push this button, something advantageous will happen for you. But be warned, if you do, a pompous elitist who you do not know and who you will never meet will be heckled mercilessly. The choice is yours. Choose wisely.